Guys, like to get started. Everyone take your seat so we can get this going. We have a briefing today. The Nuclear Energy Institute to provide overview on nuclear development. It's Maria? Oh, wow. Ms. Korsnick, President and CEO, ma'am. If you'd like to come up, if you have your people you want to come up and speak with you, that's great.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Chair Wilson. And I have with me Christine Cheese-Medea. She's going to help us with the slides. Give her just a few minutes to bring them up. Ready. And so thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. Obviously, we'll have some prepared remarks, but very much welcome your questions and comments because it's really about just kind of giving you a perspective on how things are happening maybe broadly with nuclear and maybe then a little bit more specifically in some of the other states. Maybe just to begin, a little bit about my background. I've been with the Nuclear Energy Institute now for 9 years, and prior to that, I had 30 years of experience in the nuclear industry. So as I share things with you, I would just share that I sort of know nuclear from the inside, if you will, having worked in the industry for that amount of time. I started out as an engineer. I became an operator, so I worked in the control room for a number of years as a senior control room operator. I moved up in management. Ultimately, I was a site vice president, and I ran one plant. I was a chief nuclear officer, and I was responsible for 5 plants in 3 states, and 3 locations, excuse me. And so I will also share that I spent 17 years at Calvert Cliffs. So in my job, I'm not allowed to have a favorite plant, but it's hard not to have Calvert as my favorite, as I had so many years there, and it's such a well-run plant. So anyway, I offer that as background, and let's now jump right into the slides that we have for you today. Just to begin to kind of get the lay of the land, some of you might be more familiar than others with how much nuclear that we currently have in the United States. So we have 94 reactors. These are located at 54 different sites, and they cover 28 states. Overall, nuclear today in the United States is about 19% of the total generation in the United States. Move on. To just get an idea of how does nuclear contribute today, these are some broad statistics, whether you want to look at it from a money perspective, $60 billion that is contributed to the country's gross domestic product, or if you want to look at it in terms of jobs, you can see close to 500,000 jobs, or you can look at it in terms of how much carbon emissions are avoided, 439 million metric tons are avoided by the operations of nuclear. And it's not just carbon, it's also nitrous oxides and sulfur oxides, and you can see those numbers there. What's really beautiful, I would say, about the nuclear fleet that we have today to give you confidence that the United States is one of the strongest operators for nuclear, and that is for over 2 decades, the nuclear fleet in the United States has greater than a 90% capacity factor. That's an incredibly large number. So capacity factor means it's running 90% of the time at its most capacity. And so it's really very important when we talk about nuclear being reliable, nuclear being there around the clock. It's just not something that we say. You know, to say that you've done something like that for 2 decades, you know, it doesn't mean that you got lucky, right? It means that you're really very good at what you're doing, and you should feel that pride in our nuclear fleet. Going specifically then to the state of Maryland, you have the Calvert Cliffs Clean Energy Center. You can see some statistics here about how it contributes to the state of Maryland. As I said, I used to work at the plant. I used to live very close to the plant, and very proud of that particular plant. So the nuclear that you might think of, you know, the nuclear that you think of from your history or that you think of today are really large gigawatt-sized plants, similar to the units that you would find at Calvert Cliffs. As we look forward, You will have those large gigawatt-sized plants still, but you're also going to see smaller reactors. And whether you call them small modular reactors, think of something around maybe 300 megawatts or so, and even smaller than that. We call those micro reactors. So you can think of anything from 1 to 20 megawatts. What's interesting about that is all of a sudden now nuclear has an opportunity to play in more ways, be parts of solutions in more ways than you would have imagined it in the past. So for example, if you wanted to power something that's in a very remote location, difficult to do with just a very large plant, very easy to do if you have a smaller plant. And that's what has brought a lot of interest to nuclear, for example, for people that are in remote locations, whether that's in Canada or if it's in Alaska, maybe they're running a mining operation. You wouldn't have thought that nuclear could have played a role in the past, but now there'll be opportunity. If you look at this slide, really trying to just give you a kind of paint a broader picture. When we talk about nuclear, and many of things that people are interested in is the electricity that it could produce, but it's really more than that. Some of the needs for nuclear are going to be the high temperature steam that they can create. So somebody like a Dow Chemical, some other manufacturing facilities, they actually use that high temperature steam in the business that they do. So they're very interested in a very high quality, high temperature steam, and you have reactor designs that are very well suited for that. In addition, you could get the electricity, you could do both. You could get the high temperature steam and get some electricity. You'll also be hearing hydrogen in the future. People have different opinions on how quickly, potentially, a hydrogen economy might emerge, but that's another output that you could create with nuclear. And then on the right-hand side, again, just to kind of give you a flavor of how many different industries are having conversations with us that are asking questions. Think about sustainable airline fuel that could be supported, again, through the use of nuclear. Shipping is very interested in the smaller reactors that we talk about to potentially power the large shipping industry. So really a variety of uses. Again, the value of nuclear is that you get all of this very reliable, clean power. So there's no carbon or emissions, no nitrous oxides or sulfur oxides. Let's go to the next. Well, I guess maybe first let me just stop there and see if there's any questions. Well, I'll go through this next slide and then I'll just stop and see if you have any questions before we move on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time today on all the different types of reactors. I think perhaps you've had other presentations or maybe some thoughts on this, but it wasn't intended today to go into a lot of technical detail, but just to kind of give you a flavor that when we talk about nuclear of the future, it's going to be a little bit like today. Today we have water-cooled reactors. Those are the examples that you see on the left-hand side. There's the AP1000s that were recently built in the state of Georgia. There's also the BWR X300. These are some examples of some smaller reactors, a new scale design, Holtec, and also the Westinghouse AP300. So those all fall into the category of like today, but just smaller, okay, so water cooled. But then you have different types, and so on the right-hand side, it's just talking about non-water cooled. So there's high temperature gas. An example of that would be the X-Energy design. That's the one that Amazon recently talked about investing in. The next is liquid metal reactors. An example of that is the TerraPower design. That's the one that's being built by the Bill Gates TerraPower organization out in Wyoming. And then there's a variety of molten salt reactors. You can see there one listed is Kairos. They have a reactor they call the Hermes design. That's going to be built in Tennessee. They're building their demonstration reactor now. And also you see some micro reactors. So again, a little bit even smaller, less than say 50 megawatts. You can see Oklo, Radiant, and another Westinghouse reactor called the eVinci are examples of that. So the takeaway I just wanted to share is there's sort of multiple different designs, multiple different sort of shapes and sizes that are coming to the marketplace literally over the next 5 to 10 years. So let me stop there and just see off the top of your head if you have any questions before I go on. I don't see any questions. Excellent, thank you. All right, so going on to what are some of the system benefits of advanced reactors. You can see some listed here on the slide before you. And I'll talk a little bit as we even go on into the next slide. But bottom line, the value that you're bringing to nuclear, and it really shouldn't be, is it nuclear or wind? Is it nuclear or solar? Really, it's a together, right? It's nuclear, wind, and solar, and some battery storage. If you're really thinking about, carbon-free, if that's an important thing to you, nuclear plays sort of regardless. What I mean by that is it can be the backbone because it's there around the clock and sort of always on, and so it really helps form the backbone of the grid. And so the opportunities as we look ahead are very beneficial long-term to the grid. The other thing in terms of value, and I'll go on to the next slide that really shows this. So we hired a contractor. It's called Vibrant Clean Energy, if you're familiar with them. I think there's information on the slide with a link. But basically we said, okay, imagine that we're trying to decarbonize the system. First, do it with, wind and solar and really restrain nuclear. Don't allow the system to choose nuclear as much as it wants. And then run a model where you have an unconstrained amount of nuclear. And so this slide is sort of showing you what the benefit is. And just to give you a view of the detail of this analysis, they really have the grid in the United States model to a very low level of degree. A model like this would take several days to run, for example, just to give you an idea of how well it's modeled. In the lowest cost system, nuclear was about just over 40% of the generation, and wind and solar were at about 50%. And then if you looked at the energy system that was constrained on nuclear, the cost of that system to consumers was about $450 billion more. $450 billion, right? So you scratch your head and you're like, wow, that's huge. Like what's going on here? And so just to peel that back a little bit, I would share that what happens when you overdevelop a distributed resource, so if you have a lot of wind and solar in a lot of places, you end up really needing a lot of transmission and distribution to hook that distributed resource to your grid. Whereas if you balance that with a more concentrated resource, such as nuclear, whether that's in 300 megawatt chunks or even 1,000 megawatt chunks, and you balance out the need for how much additional transmission and distribution, at the end of the day, the consumer pays for both, right? The consumer's paying not only for that generation, but they're also paying for the transmission and distribution. So I just offer you that as food for thought. We at NEI, we have about 350 members, just for you to appreciate the different companies that I represent. So we represent the entire value chain of nuclear, from people that do mining to mine the uranium, to people that convert and enrich that uranium, to the utilities that operate the nuclear plants today, to the advanced reactor vendors that are developing those reactors of tomorrow, to folks that are servicing these, so the supply chain, whether that's Westinghouse or GE or some smaller suppliers, or the folks that are interested in decommissioning at the end of the life of these assets. So we surveyed our members, and this slide shows you some highlights of that survey, that more than 90% of the fleet that we have today expects to operate to 80 years. So when these units were first commissioned and first put in service, they were for 40 years. We've had a license extension that took them from 40 years to 60 years. And now what plants are going through is their second license extension, which is taking them from 60 years to 80 years. And so the plants that we have today will be operating well into the 2050s. I offer that to say it doesn't mean there's anything magic about 80 years, and I could envision in the future how some of these 80-year assets will be going for an extension again. Part of the reason that you can do these kinds of extensions, and I can speak firsthand from plants that I was responsible for, is that these plants are very well maintained. Systems are changed out routinely. The maintenance on these facilities is done very well. And so, for example, I ran the Gannett plant, which is near Rochester, New York. It was built in 1969, and if I were to tour you in that facility, I would tell you it was a teenager in terms of how well kept that plant is, and the systems have been replaced and changed out along the way. So be sure not to judge these assets by years. Judge them by what how well they operate and how well they're maintained. When you talk to the utilities not quite yet. If you talk to the utilities that were involved in this survey, they want to add 100 gigawatts of new nuclear by 2050. So to kind of look at what we have today, the U.S. fleet produces just about 100 gigawatts. It's probably closer to 94, 95 gigawatts. And so to show you the interest in the current utilities that own nuclear to want to double the amount of electricity that they get from nuclear by 2050. I would also point out that those utilities are 40% of the market in the electricity. So it doesn't account for new entrants to the market, whether those new entrants are people like Dow Chemical that are interested to build a plant, their first one will be in Texas, or whether it's some of the hyperscalers that are interested in data centers. This 100 gigawatts is sort of before you add in any of that. So what does it take to get some of these plants going? I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about what that would involve. So from an early mover perspective, it's very hard to build the very first of a kind. It hasn't been built before. You're trying out the supply chain, et cetera. There's lots of opportunities. We're very happy for the AP1000s to be completed in Georgia. It was not a well-paved road. It was challenging. And so there's, I'd say, 3 elements to sort of really seeing the nuclear build-out commence. And some of that's industry de-risking, things that the industry can do. And those are things like, let's understand how to build these and better and faster. That's the construction best practices. We've been involved in pulling those construction best practices together and providing those to our members. Also identifying the risks, as you would any project, and understand ways to ameliorate that. And building more than one, right? Because the idea is once you get good at doing something, the idea is to do it again and again, and in that way we get better. We're also working at the federal level. You'll have seen in the last administration some very important tax incentives that were passed in the IIJA that was passed and the IRA that was passed, some pretty significant tax incentives for the industry. One was on the current fleet, and that was to give confidence that there was value in these assets, because not too many years ago, you would have heard us talking about plants that were closing. And since the tax incentive that was put on the current fleet, you're not only not hearing about plants closing, you're hearing about plants restarting. And I would say a huge benefit there. There's also a tax incentive, both a production tax credit and an investment tax credit, to build something new. And that's very encouraging to help to sort of get the ball rolling on the new builds. Other things that you do at the federal level are things like loan guarantees, helping cost share at a demonstration level. All of those are in effect today. And again, a special extra attention to ones that want to go first. We call those early mover support. An example of that is cost overrun insurance that we're looking to get some support at the federal level for. There was a bill that was introduced by Senator Risch at the end of the last Congress, and we look forward to that being reintroduced in this Congress. And there's also state policies. These are things, obviously, for your folks to think about and to digest, depending on how much that you're interested in encouraging nuclear in your state. There's things that can be done at an energy policy level, reliability, valuing highly reliable assets. If you're interested in things being sustainable, carbon-free, ways to help improve and make more efficient the permitting process, all very helpful in a nuclear journey. I covered this a little bit, but this just goes into a little more detail on the tax credits, the demonstrations that were awarded. Really just wanted to give you a flavor that nuclear enjoys bipartisan support, and over the last several years, you've really seen very strong support by both Democrats and Republicans, and this sort of goes to show that. Bipartisan support? Yeah. Yeah. It's a rarity. Yeah, actually, and I'll dwell on that just a minute. I work in DC, and so I appreciate how challenging that times can be in terms of partisanship, but I will also share that nuclear really does enjoy bipartisan support, and if it's for different reasons. Normally the Democrats are very supportive of the carbon-free, of the value from a climate perspective. The Republicans a little bit more interested in the national security aspect, both sides very interested in the jobs. And so anyway, I just share that nuclear brings very many different attributes to the market, and it's because of those very many different attributes that we get this bipartisan support. And another example of that was in the last Trump administration, they kicked off what was called the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, and then the Biden administration funded that Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, and of course that program is in effect today. I'm going to the next one. We'll talk about accelerating deployments for nuclear. Again, the hardest thing when you have a new design is to go first. And so we're really focused right now on the early mover discussions, if you will, to kind of get things going. But the next phase is then getting that order book. And it's when you have, we're going to build 4 or 5 or 10 or 20 of these, that really ignites the supply chain. And I can share with you, we work in very many different states. I'm really amazed if you compare the today world versus the world back maybe in the 70s and 80s. Back in the 70s and 80s, you had a bit more of the utilities, understanding that this is something that needed to be done and figuring it out. I can tell you that today world, you have governors that are, talking to folks saying, I want nuclear in my state. And how do I get nuclear in my state? And not only do they want to build nuclear in their state, they want to be in the supply chain. They're looking ahead. They're appreciating that nuclear is on its opportunity. It's on its way to a very significant, thriving environment, and they want to be a part of it. Gosh, I could name so many, but, I know Wyoming is very engaged in this. Utah, I was just recently in Indiana, where I testified at a hearing and spoke with the governor there. There's, states that want to work together. Tennessee is very engaged. They have commissioned a nuclear advisory panel that I'm on. The governor of Virginia, very engaged, as is Georgia. Texas is doing something. I guess, Christine, I'll even turn to you for a moment. She's the person that we have in lead for the states, but I don't know if it's going to be a grant program or what, but we appreciate that they're working on something. I think they just recently announced this week that they're going to build 3 micro-reactors at one of their universities there, Texas A&M, and they're already building a reactor at, I think it's Abilene Christian College. So yeah, Texas is, very, very interested and engaged. Last year alone, 25 states took action to support nuclear energy. So that's half of the United States taking action to support. This slide shows you a handful, and it lists the states on the right-hand side and some of the actions that are being taken. I'll just point out on the third line item, removing barriers and signaling support. You know, there are some states that had moratorium on building nuclear, and I would just point out the number of states, and the ones listed are repealing their nuclear moratoriums, and it's obviously a very significant mix. And again, I'm just trying to point out little signals, right, that are saying you can see that people are preparing to be a part of the upcoming opportunity that nuclear has to really thrive. We also work internationally. I will just offer, I travel quite a bit internationally, and the conversation that we're having here, it's not unique to the United States, right? So countries around the world are very interested in nuclear. I would say, you know, countries have made a U-turn, quite frankly, on their support of nuclear. You have countries that at one point were shutting down their nuclear plants, and you now have them very interested to rebuild, right? So France is obviously has always been a strong proponent, and is even more so looking to build. You know, you could go on Sweden and Finland, Poland, the United Kingdom. I've traveled to Africa. There's countries in Africa that are also very interested. And that sort of brings in a bit of the national security conversation. So I'll just add that China and Russia are very interested in taking the lead on commercial nuclear power, and they're very interested in building in other people's countries. Russia today is building in 10 different countries their Russian reactor. And I think we all watched how they decided to turn off the gas supply to Europe. And so in that same way, from a national security perspective, we're very interested that the U.S., with the talent and the technique and the proven history that we have on running these nuclear plants, that we would like American technology to be in other countries. The other value to that is, as I mentioned, with subsequent license renewal, these aren't 20-year assets. These are 100-year assets. So when you build a commercial nuclear plant in somebody else's country, you're forging a 100-year relationship with that country. That's really very valuable. And so for lots of reasons, it's important for us, and these are conversations that we have at the federal level for the fact that if we could get the United States building nuclear here, it also helps our companies get interest in building the American technology elsewhere. I'll land on this last slide. It's a map that shows all the different projects that are underway or will be in operation in the early 2030s. Some of these are pilot projects. Some of these are commitments that folks have made, and you can see here on the chart whether it's a large project, whether it's a small or it's a micro, or if it's already operating. And the two orange ones, orange dots you see there in Georgia, represent the AP1000s that just went online last year, 2023 and 2024. So that wraps up my formal comments, but again, I think the point of my being here is to be helpful to you and any comments or questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Before we get to some questions, I see some lights going on. I see you guys. I want to talk to you about, let's start with safety. And the reason a lot of the country or nations turned away from nuclear energy was the safety component. You know, the one that happened in Japan, I think, is that the most recent one, I think? So what is being done, to alleviate those concerns, could you basically express how you believe these new projects are being designed to avoid those issues?
Sure. Well, I'll start with Fukushima, and we're actually very close to Japan. I visited Fukushima after the accident, actually talked to the operators that were in the control room at that time. I was a chief nuclear officer. We actually took all of the chief nuclear officers from the United States to Japan to have conversations, and then subsequently invited the chief nuclear officers of Japan to visit the United States. So very familiar. We also formed a Fukushima Response Steering Committee in the United States, which I ran. And so so I can just share at a high level, I would tell you that Japan is restarting the plants that they closed, and I can tell you that Japan is also talking about building nuclear. So before we even talk about what happened at Fukushima, I can tell you that the place that it happened at is building nuclear. Okay, that should tell us something, okay? I would also share that, the designs that we have today are very safe. As I shared, I've operated them, I've lived next to them without any question. I was pregnant with both of my children while operating nuclear power plants without any concern. And so I would just share that specifically in response to Fukushima, I can tell you what they needed was power and water. Obviously, they were hit by a very high-level wave, 40 feet tall, and it decimated their safety equipment. Because in Japan, they have a lot of earthquakes. And so when you have earthquakes, you worry about things being elevated. So they put some of their most important safety equipment in the basement. The problem is when you have a 40-foot wave, it got to the basement. And so it took out a lot of that safety equipment. So here in the United States, again, we operate extremely well. We required plants to get even additional equipment than what they already have designed, but we went beyond that. And there's two areas. One is in Tennessee and one is in Arizona, both near FedEx facilities, where we have pre-staged all the necessary equipment that any of the plants in the United States might need that can be taken to those plants on very short notice. And I feel very confident that there is, things in place, necessary things in place, that if for some reason the equipment got decimated at any of the plants that we operate, that appropriate equipment in terms of power and water would be supplied to those. So in terms of a specific Fukushima, response, the items that we're talking about, the other plants that we're talking about building, are building even safer than the plants that we have today. Safer meaning fewer actions are required. In some cases, no actions are required, kind of thing. It's, I'll say, fail-safe. But I also want to share that the plants that we have today are extremely safe.
Thank you. That was, again, because that's one of the bigger concerns. In addition, a concern that's been brought to my attention is security. And I understand we have grid security, i.e. when you take these offline, but also just the concern that, well, I guess using drones to blow up certain parts of a reactor could spell disaster for that surrounding region. So, and I've been to Calvert Cliffs, and I know there's security there, physical security. For the SMRs, do they require that same amount of security, the smaller reactors?
I would say all of the reactors will require some amount of security. The plants are designed, each design is a little bit different. For example, some might be designed underground. And so they would have maybe a different security profile than those. So I think it'll be plant specific, but certainly some security will be required for the assets that'll be built.
And lastly, I want to talk about waste. Firstly, I want to make sure I'm not missing something. We don't reuse the spent rods, correct? There is a one-time usage in this country. Do other countries reuse the spent rods before they determine their actual waste?
They do. And so, yeah, I guess at a high level for waste, I would just say your children, your grandchildren, and their grandchildren are going to be very interested in this thing you call waste. I think we should look at it as a future resource. I already have companies that are members of NEI that are interested in, my words, mining the waste. They're interested in some of those products, whether they're making probes that go to outer space, or in some cases they're making probes that go deep undersea, and they look at elements that are in what we call waste that will be helpful. We have some reactor vendors that are also interested in using some of the things that we call waste today to help them with their fuel supply. So there are things that we can do with the waste. We have chosen in this country not to do those things right now. There are other countries that do. France is a good example. They reprocess. In any case, we'll still need a long-term repository. That's something that will be necessary and needed. But at some point, we'll have a broader view of, I'd say, bringing the fuel cycle full circle. And in the meantime, it needs to just be safely stored, and it is very safely stored today.
Is there any movement nationally to adopt like France's model of reusing these spent rods before we determine their race, or excuse me, that their waste?
Sure. There are some conversations that are going on now. There's some, as I mentioned, since some companies are interested to do that, they have started those conversations with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, for example. Our Department of Energy is also, something that would be investigating that. So absolutely, those conversations are starting. I would just share that it's, we're in a very safe position today, and I think there's a lot of options as we look forward to the future.
Thank you very much. Adams?
So good morning, and thank you for the presentation today. Last fall, our committee went to PJM. That was the first time I was exposed to the idea that, a company like Microsoft, wants to invest and basically start up a nuclear reactor in Pennsylvania. In Virginia, Amazon Web Services, AWS, is committing, their resources to advanced technologies. And you can see these businesses trying to capture, their future business model and market share through the lens of energy. And I guess the question is, what can these tech companies do to help Maryland advance, I would think, goals related to nuclear and advancing these technologies that I think, if we're reading other states, they view it as a critical challenge, and how can they help Maryland reach that challenge would be my question for you.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. And we, work with the variety of the hyperscalers that you mentioned, and I can tell you they're very hungry. This AI data center adventure is a very thirsty adventure. It wants a lot of megawatts, and every time you hear an estimate, give it a few months, and it seems like that estimate doubles. And so it's a very, very hungry for megawatts adventure. And I would tell you, you are ripe for partnering with some of these hyperscalers. They are absolutely looking for places where they can make investments, and they are willing, because the conversations we have with them obviously is help us de-risk and get some of these, first-of-a-kind things moving. So when you build the first of something, and then you build it again, and you build it again, and you build it again, you really come down the cost curve. And the nth of a kind, imagine that's maybe after maybe the sixth or seventh of a version of something, could be even 50 to 60% of the cost of that first one, just to give you an appreciation of how important it is that the United States start building again and come down this cost curve. The hyperscalers understand this. We've had a lot of conversations about why that investment up front is so needed. Now they're getting more hungry and more challenged to get the clean power that they want. And so I would tell you it's a ripe time to have a conversation with hyperscalers about what they could do and help the state of Maryland, create a win-win.
I'll just ask a follow-up real quick, and that is that these SMRs seem like they're new technology. What would be like the timeline? We're sitting here in 2025. If the state moves aggressively and there's partnership and real demand, how long is it going to take to start seeing some of these new technologies actually hit the ground? Best case scenario. I mean, like if you're an early mover.
Well, the GE X300 is getting a construction permit in Canada as we speak. I think they had their final hearing earlier in January. They expect to start construction, I would say, next year, end of this year. They're already doing site preparation now. So we would be a fast follower to the Canada adventure. The NuScale reactor, which is similar to light water reactor design, they're getting their NRC approval, I think, by June of this year, and then they will be poised for construction here. They will be constructing in Romania. They have already ordered their long lead vessels, as an example. I think they have 12 vessels that have been ordered. You can learn a lot in terms of who's actually putting money into long lead items. That's an example, of a company that's doing that. Of course, the AP1000s, we've already built 2 of them in Georgia. So, I would tell you, there would be the least risk design because you absolutely know how to build those because we've done that already. That's a large design, not the SMR that you asked for. But I would tell you in the very near term on a micro reactor, which again, a little bit smaller, we have some of those designs that should be going in operation in the next year or 2. So you have designs that are coming to the marketplace and will continue to come to the marketplace. But you have designs that will be in operation by 2030 if people commence the build.
Okay, 2030. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a few questions. You had mentioned U.S. talent. How much talent is there in the U.S. and did there used to be a lot more talent back in the 50s and 60s? And when we compare to what's going on around the world, like how much of this can be built by U.S. companies in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I think it all can be built by the U.S. Here. Do we need more talent? Sure. What we need is for there to be a real appreciation that U.S. nuclear will be thriving in the very near term, and that gets kids studying it. But I'm a nuclear engineer, as an example. You don't actually need a lot of nuclear engineers. When you run a power plant, right, you need electrical engineers and mechanical engineers. You need mechanics and electricians and instrument and control technicians. And so I would tell you, that they're out there. In some cases, we could always use more, but they're out there. And when there's an understanding that nuclear is sort of new and cool again, I think we'll be attracting that talent. First, we got to construct them, right? And to construct anything, we're going to be competing with people that are constructing bridges and data centers and whatnot. I talked to the union presidents across the board, and they're obviously very busy at the moment building data centers. But, the view is once you start building that nuclear plant, you actually attract that talent from some of these other jobs. And the reason you do is because now you have a job that's going to take you 4, 5, 6 years to build. And so you're at one location for many years. That's attractive to a lot of this kind of talent. So I think we're on the cusp of attracting a lot of additional talent to the United States. But yes, we will be competing with other sectors that are building things. Nuclear generally pays more than other jobs. So we generally have a way of attracting that talent to make it happen.
So the United States is well positioned, comparatively speaking, to other countries to.
I don't want to say it's going to be easy, but I can tell you that we have good schools and universities, and I think we'll be able to get there.
Okay, and then are there any other? So I guess my next question is on cybersecurity issues. Like, is there a big concern about hacking into these systems by other foreign adversaries that could destabilize reactors, and how is that handled?
So we've been actually concerned about cybersecurity for close to 2 decades, and there's very rigorous regulations relative to cybersecurity that's in place at all our plants today. And essentially what you do is air gap it is the term. You can't access any control functions outside of the nuclear plant. It's a standalone island, if you will. And so those, again, have been in place, and they get very closely monitored by the regulator. On a regular basis. You've identified what we call critical assets or critical digital assets to make sure that they're all well maintained and protect that air gap.
Okay, so it's almost like it's almost like you're cut off from the outside.
That's exactly right.
To ensure there's no way.
That's exactly right.
Way in.
That's
okay.
exactly right.
And then my last question is, going forward, are there other types of nuclear that we should be considering, like fusion versus fission? What is on the horizon that's kind of some cool stuff that might be coming?
Well, I showed you a lot of cool stuff in my slides. So I would say there's a lot of cool stuff coming.
I was told it's actually, I was actually told earlier today that, David, don't say it's cool stuff, say it's hot stuff. And I was like,
Well, it's cool and hot stuff. I'm not a fusion expert, so I'm just gonna put it there. I think there's exciting investment in fusion. I think there's a lot of conversation around fusion, and, will there be fusion in our future? We're all going to be a lot older by the time we see that fusion. And so I think it's something to follow. It's something to be aware of. But in terms of, the ratepayers that you have today, the clean electricity that you have today, and data centers that you need to make sure get off the ground and running, because we do want to lead in AI. And if we don't have the power to feed this AI, as you would imagine, people will start looking other places, right, to develop the AI, which is not what we want. So I think the immediate 10, 15, 20 years, I would tell you that's fission. But yeah, there's interesting stuff happening on fusion. I just think it's a little further away than the fission.
all right, thank you so much. Thank
Sure.
you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. Great to see you again.
You as well.
I remember finally my time at Calvert Cliffs, and I remember you being there, and I really appreciate you coming down and talking to the folks about this emerging technology. Again, I can't thank you enough. One of the concerns I hear about with data centers, and I know we're going to hear about it with nuclear as well, and I think it's a legitimate concern, is water consumption. Based on the new technology, can you walk us through a little bit about the water consumption? Is that, because we have those boiling water reactors at Calvert Cliffs, it's basically a radiator for everybody. So it's cooled by the Chesapeake Bay, which is completely separated from water that's internal to the plant. So it's essentially a radiator system. These new systems that are coming online, is that the same case? Are they going to be, have to be co-located next to bodies of water, or are they internally cooled?
Yeah, so there's lots of different designs. So I don't want to maybe speak to any particular one, but I can tell you that there's designs that are being built specifically with water consumption as part of the model. Like they want to be able to be, let's say, placed in a desert, or placed someplace where you're not going to have a large body of water next to you. And there are designs that are suited for that. I don't want to say it's every design, because it kind of depends, but yes, there are absolutely ones that are looking at the water usage and to be able to be in a very arid location.
So we have a little bit of availability, like a shopping cart almost.
It's exactly right, and I kind of like how you say that. There's going to be a lot of tools in the toolkit here, and that's really one of the things I wanted to really leave you with, is that the nuclear of yesterday, you just thought of these large plants off someplace doing good work, maybe didn't even know where they were or what they were doing. The nuclear of tomorrow is going to come in all these shapes and sizes. Some of them are going to be paired, like right next to a manufacturing facility, as I mentioned, because they want that high temperature steam, for example. Well, you want to be right next to the source, get that steam right over into whatever you're trying to use the steam for. So it kind of marries with some of these assets being sort of very close. Again, some places in very remote locations, you're going to want that energy source to help you. One of the reasons that these assets are very interesting also is, for example, some of them would only need to be refueled every 10 to 15 years. Well, if you're in a hard-to-get place and you get that energy supply, it's kind of nice that you don't have to deliver more fuel for 10 or 15 years, because wherever you are, it's remote, it might be hard to get to, right? So there's some very interesting aspects of this new technology. The fact that it's carbon-free, I would just say it's like icing on the cake. The fact that we appreciate as we go forward, we have to be thoughtful about what we're doing with the environment. These go hand in glove with those concerns.
And the modeling that you use for the constrained versus non-constrained nuclear formalizations, I guess that's the best way to talk about it. Are other states using that as a tool when they're, having these conversations internally about we have what's called rate portfolio standard, right? So it's basically our shopping cart of energy production. Are they using that tool?
Absolutely. I know up in the Northwest specifically, they used a company called E3, and they did a similar study where they did it with, they wanted to go clean. The governor had given them a clean energy mandate, and they did it with renewables, and then they did a separate model where they did renewables, and I think they modeled small modular reactors for that. And I'm trying to think if it was 80 billion, like 70 or 80 billion dollars a year difference to the ratepayers by adding nuclear to the system. And so it wasn't the same model I would think that Vibrant Clean Energy used, but anyway, it's a similar conversation. And I'm sure that study is available. It's a couple of years old now, but I'm sure we could get you information on that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you. So my question, I think, is more of what we can learn from where we are already operating here in the U.S. I got kind of stuck on your second slide where you showed where we have reactors in the states, and I think that's Illinois that has the most. And then that's South Carolina, that's second or something down there?
Yeah, South Carolina, North Carolina, they have a lot
Okay.
too. Yeah.
So I guess some of the questions that people have asked about, you know, if you can tell me the profile, maybe just starting with Illinois. One, how are they integrated with the other sources of renewables that we talked about, because you talked about how nuclear can integrate with that. Again, looking at the geography, I'm guessing that Illinois would have to get water from the lakes, but I would think that might be some limits there because of how much of those areas need water from the lakes. And then I'm not sure what wind looks like for them and solar. Can you talk to that issue as well as some of the safety and security things people are talking about? How are things operating in Illinois? I mean, I never knew something was there, so I don't know if it's been a problem or what.
Sure. Well, can't say that I'm an expert on Illinois, but I can share a couple of data points with you. Illinois was one of the areas that you had a lot of conversation around the tax credits and the need for tax credits. They were actually, really challenged with the marketplace in Illinois, and it's, it's an example of where when people are trying to do a good thing, sometimes it doesn't actually turn out as good as what you thought. So wind and solar was getting a lot of tax credits. And as a result of that, those tax credits, they wanted wind and solar to operate because that's how you got the dollars of your tax credits. And as a result, the wind and solar operation, which was a lot, was causing the nuclear plants to not need to operate and have to shut down, partially down power. That put a lot of stress on those assets to say, well, if I can't operate all the time, it makes it very challenging then to run that asset. And so Illinois became a bit of a concentration, let's say, of conversations around the value of those nuclear assets. And trying not to go through the whole story, but there were zero emission credits. That conversation started, and then there were the federal tax credits that we talked about. And I would say that today, I think Illinois values their nuclear plants extremely. As a result, they went out of their way to ensure that they had continued operation. They are continuing to operate today. They value the credits that they got to continue to do that. And I can say that, as you look ahead, we talked about these hyperscalers, et cetera. The nuclear plants are very much sort of, desired. Palisades, not in Illinois, it's in Michigan, but that was a plant that was shut down that now a company has chosen to restart it. There's a plant in Iowa that has been shut down. Also, they're looking to restart that. And of course, 3 Mile Island that we talked about in Pennsylvania. So this thirst and hunger for these data centers, and they're trying to figure out where to operate to get some of this clean power, has really provided very useful to places such as Illinois that have a lot of nuclear.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the presentation. I'm trying to work on, we're in the process of having these conversations about how do we ensure sufficient generation and at the lowest cost possible. And so these questions, these sort of optimization questions of what's the right mix and what kind of modeling, gets us that right mix, and then what policies drive that. And I'm looking at, I just tried to quickly look at the, VCE report, and I'm just trying to understand, it looks like So first of all, the constraint is not that it's policy constrained, right? The constraint is that you have supply chain, workforce, and some regulatory hurdles, right? So the unconstrained, it says, starts at 3,800 kilowatts per hour and then goes down with 5% learning. And then the constrained, because of supply chain, workforce, and regulatory issues, starts at $5,500 per kilowatt hour, right?
Yeah, we just invented, you can't get it, whether it's a supply chain problem, whether it's a people problem. We
Okay.
just basically didn't allow the model to select it. Constrained the model from selecting it.
But it constrained the model, so it resulted in a higher cost, right? It wasn't a policy constraint that said you can't build nuclear. It was supply chain, workforce, some regulatory, which could be tied to policy, right? I'm just trying to understand.
You can name it whatever you want. We simply said to the model, there could be problems, and as a result of that, and you just listed what it was, I don't know, whatever, $5,500 a kilowatt hour.
So best case scenario, sorry, was $3,800 a kilowatt hour, and then that was sort of if everything works well, right? And then if you have constraints, I mean, this is listing those as the constraints, but I didn't actually
Right.
see the whole, I didn't have time to read the whole report.
Yeah, no, I'm just
in the
saying, from a
10 minutes
model
here.
perspective, it's just a mathematical thing. You just said,
Okay.
I know you want to go get nuclear, but you can't. The idea was to deliberately constrain it, for a variety of things could happen, right?
So then there's two things that are, so I just wanted to make sure I understand that, because then I think there is a question about sort of, with all of the technologies that we've been wanting to promote, where there's sort of the best case scenario, and then there's the realities, and I'm trying to understand how we ought to be modeling these things in this state. Sort of looking at Georgia, which was counting on that reactor, and it was twice as costly as expected. Is that
Yeah.
right? Was it twice as costly or 3 times as
Yeah, and I'll
costly?
tell you, if you don't build something for 30 years,
No,
and
I
you
understand-
decide to
I
build it,
understand why. I'm just
which is
trying to-
why we need to get started, quite frankly. But yes, you're right. They had a lot of challenges on that one.
Okay, so I guess I'll look further into this question. I'm interested in these cost questions.
Sure.
Because I think on principle, we can be wherever, and there's different ideas where we are on principle. But I think the cost questions are really challenging ones in trying to figure out like what the right balance of the pieces.
Absolutely. And I would just offer, outside of here, we have folks that are involved in this modeling kind of work outside of here, are happy to provide that as a resource to answer, additional questions if that's something that's, that's helpful, or give you, more information in terms of, other ways to model it, or other companies that model it.
I do have one other question. I'm sorry, I'm trying to be
Sure.
quick because I know other people have questions. I think the timeliness is the second question. And so to your point about we hadn't built a new nuclear reactor in 20 years, and so Georgia was 10 years late and twice as costly, or whatever it was. When we're thinking and modeling out for this state, if we were trying to think about, you gave us some dates of when I think those are prototypes that would be online. Do you have numbers that are out there about like when some of the new nuclear would be sort of implementable on scale, as opposed to like when we're, in a few years, we may see these prototypes?
I think there'll be a significant build out of nuclear in the United States in the 2030s. 2030s, 2040s, without question.
And do you have a sense of like where in the 2030s?
Well, they'll be brought online in the early 30s, but the initial ones, I can just tell you from what the electric utilities today are looking to do when they want to add 100 gigawatts by 2050. Just kind of work backwards from that. You have people that are making commitments for 2033 and 2035, and so. I would just share directionally, it's going to be large. And that's why you have so many states that are interested in trying to figure out how to get in the supply chain. There's a lot of conversations out there.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. Appreciate your presentation. I suspect the answer to my question is it depends and it's site-specific, but with all the closures of the fossil fuel plants, does it make sense and is it economically feasible to retrofit those sites to nuclear, and has it been done anywhere in the U.S.?
Yeah, in fact, coal to nuclear is a very interesting proposition and something I'd strongly encourage you to look at in your state to see if that's something that's useful. The reason I share that is from the gentleman that asked earlier about workforce. We can repurpose that workforce that's at a coal site to work at a nuclear site. So when I ran power plants and we would get into a refueling outage, we would bring folks from the coal sites to participate in the refueling outage. And why is that, right? At a nuclear plant, you boil water a little different. After that, it's a power plant, right? It has a turbine, it has valves, it has pumps. And so the same kind of work that these folks are doing in other fields can easily be adapted. They have electricians, INC techs, et cetera. So one of the things we do need to look at is as you want to close some assets, let's just pick coal as an example, some towns are really built up around these coal facilities and they're really, the high employer, if you will, in the local area. There is no reason why you couldn't either on the same site or very nearby, site a small modular reactor and have that talent. In fact, we did a study on that. I think our study, it was by Scott Madden, I think it said 75% of the coal workforce could be repurposed to nuclear. I challenge that, and I would tell you it's higher than 75%. But it's what, a fresh look, if you will, said about it. And so that's a beauty of this asset is the fact that it is a very strong employer, and you know yourself from the work at Calvert Cliffs, I would say how good an employer it is, in that local area. And that should be one of our concerns as we have to step away from some of these other assets. You don't want to leave, ghost communities behind. So why wouldn't you put some of these, give you that reliable power back in a different way and get all those jobs?
Yeah, awesome, thank you. And then my other question, in the states where the nuclear plants are being built, are they in a regulated or deregulated market?
So the ones that are being discussed right now, I would say the majority are in regulated. But I would say that you also have folks in a merchant market that are interested. I'm trying to just really quickly off the top of my head say, for example, the state of New York. I think, again, talking about places that have perhaps made a U-turn. That state has, in the not too distant past, closed some nuclear assets. And I can tell you now they're very interested in building nuclear, and they are looking to partner with folks to figure out how to bring some new nuclear back. And right now I think they're looking at existing sites as something that they could do more quickly. But again, just a good example of how times are changing.
And that was New York? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
And lastly, we have Delegate Fisher.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Maria, for being here. And I want to thank the Chairman Wilson and Vice Chair Crosby for bringing this very important issue forward. I mean that sincerely. So, Maria, I'm curious, obviously, nuclear power in Calvert County, you work there, I represent there. And you have in your packet here, it takes 8 to 10 years to build a new reactor. Would that also, do you think, based on your experience, you don't work there anymore, I know that, but based on your experience, do you think it would also take 8 to 10 years at Calvert Cliffs to build a third reactor?
Yeah, so obviously it depends on what you're building.
Of course, fair enough.
I would also share that when you say something like 8 to 10 years, there's a lot of work that you start with, site characterization, a permit, It's not 8 to 10 years once you start pouring the concrete, right? It's, it's
Government affairs, government regulation.
Yeah. And so there's, so what I share is, in some places that you might select, maybe some of those things are already started. A lot of times people say, if I wanted to do something right now, like what would I do? And I'd say, go get an early site permit. An early site permit will take you maybe a couple of years to get finalized, and all you would need is an envelope. I don't know exactly what I want to build, but it's something like this. They can get that early site permit for that, and it will help the permitting downstream go a little bit more quickly.
But obviously part of the regulatory part.
That's right.
Is part of the regulatory part of this, if not one of the most important parts, is probably the NIMBYs, not in my backyard folks, who I would imagine in this state in particular, it would be very difficult to do, except for probably one place, which is in the district that I represent where people actually want it. Which is the truth. They do. They want it. We've wanted the third reactor for years, as
That's
you
right.
know.
I was there when you were planning a third reactor.
That's right. And there was a French company that was
That's right.
looking at purchasing and actually making that investment.
right.
And that ended up not happening for a whole variety of reasons. So my other question is given that it would take still 8 years to potentially do that, depending on the technology, I mean, obviously there needs to be some sort of stopgap in between with the power requirements that we need. And I know that's not something that you can necessarily speak to because it's a policy decision, but it seems obvious. TerraPower, you mentioned that. That's the Bill Gates company that uses
That's right.
nuclear waste to power nuclear power plants. Is that,
No, I wouldn't say that.
that's what it shows online. I watched the YouTube video with him. I was just curious.
Well, he has a future design of a different reactor that might be suited to
that's
what
not what
you're
he's building now?
describing. Yeah, I wouldn't describe the reactor he's building now as doing that. But I wouldn't say that one in the future wouldn't, but I wouldn't characterize the current one as
Got it.
that.
And then lastly, Brandon Shores and Morgantown.
The coal plants.
Coal plants, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So Morgantown is closed in Charles County, right adjacent to the Harry Nice Bridge.
Right.
In Charles County on the Potomac River. Brandon Shores, of course, is about to be closed, or they're looking at closing it. It's safe to say that small, modern nuclear reactors could be put there as well, and you did kind of testify to that, if you will. Something that could be looked at?
Oh, yeah, I mean, any place that you're going to put a nuclear reactor, obviously, there's site characterizations, right, that need to be done. A site like Calvert, since it houses nuclear reactors, when I would say you'd feel pretty confident that you could put another one there because you've done the level of
Because the grid's already there, right? The
characterization.
transmission lines are already there.
That's right, that's
So-
right. And that's why the cold and nuclear, in general, is being looked at. There has been an analysis done, I would say, I think the Department of Energy did it, that it looked at all the coal plants in the United States in terms of, some opportunity to build nuclear. For the reason that you just said, the transmission is there. That's a very significant asset, in and of itself.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
So, yeah. And just real quick, because you brought up NIMBY, not in my backyard, I would just share, it's a new world out there in a lot of places. You guys know your state, actually our state. I live here in Maryland as well. But, I would just share that in Wyoming, they had 4 towns fight over who got the nuclear plant. And so it's not like you imagine in the past where people are saying, I don't want it in my backyard. They had 4 towns that said, please put it in mine. And then one town won. And then in not too distant future, they talked about, well, wait a minute, we might put one in your area too. So I just want to share that when I say nuclear is going to be thriving, it's not because we're going to be pushing nuclear. It's because people are pulling for nuclear. That's the today.
Well, thank you very much, ma'am. I appreciate the elucidating this committee. We have 1 o'clock bill hearings, so please, committee, if you could, for once, be on time. You're killing me. Go out, get some food, and come on back. So we'll see you guys at 1 o'clock. Thank you guys very much, and thank you, presenters.